July 1945, Camp Swift, Texas. The exam room door swung open with a metallic groan, and Captain David Morrison looked up from his clipboard to see a young woman clinging to the doorframe, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her German uniform hung on her frame like a shroud draped over wire. She took one step forward, and her legs trembled so violently that the American nurse beside her instinctively reached out to steady her. I cannot close my legs," the woman whispered in halting English, her voice barely audible above the clicking ceiling fan. Morrison had treated shrapnel wounds in North Africa, seen men torn apart by artillery in Italy, watched soldiers waste away from malaria and dysentery. But nothing had prepared him for what he saw when she removed her boots. If you're captivated by untold stories from World War II, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these hidden histories to light. The leather peeled away and the smell hit first old sweat, infection, the sour tang of flesh that had been dying for months. Her calves were skeletal, the bones pressing against skin so thin it seemed translucent. Her feet were a map of suffering, open sores, broken toenails, raw patches where shoe leather had rubbed straight through to bone. Morrison, a 42-year-old doctor who prided himself on clinical detachment, felt his stomach tighten. At 5'6", Keith Schmidt weighed 87 pounds, and in that moment, staring at the living skeleton before him, Morrison realized that Germany's collapse hadn't been just military. It had been biological, a slow starvation of its own people that propaganda could never hide. To understand how a 24-year-old clerk from Hamburg arrived in Texas with legs like kindling, you had to go back 9 months to the winter when Germany's carefully orchestrated system of order and efficiency began to devour itself. Keith had never been a soldier. She worked in a supply office near Hamburg, stamping forms, tracking shipments, managing the endless paperwork that kept the Reich's logistics machine functioning. In early 1944, her life still had structure. Trains ran on schedule. Warehouses held inventory. Her ration card, though modest, provided bread, a little meat, some fat. It wasn't abundance, but it was enough. Then the bombs came. Hamburg, a vital port and industrial hub, became a target of relentless Allied air raids. Night after night, the sky glowed orange, and by morning, entire districts had been reduced to blackened rubble. The air tasted of ash and cordite. Warehouses burned. Rail lines twisted in the heat. The supply chain that Keith spent her days documenting on paper began to disintegrate in fire and rubble. By autumn 1944, the numbers on her forms told a story the propaganda ministers refused to acknowledge. Trains that had always arrived now simply vanished from the schedules. Depots that had once overflowed reported empty shelves. Food designated for civilian workers was redirected to soldiers at the front, soldiers who themselves were often hungry. Kada's ration, once 1,200 calories a day on paper, shrank to 800, then 600. And even those meager numbers were promises rarely kept. The cruelest irony was that Keith worked in supply, yet found herself at the bottom of the priority list. Combat troops came first. Factory workers who built tanks and planes came second. Office workers like her people who shuffled papers rather than forged steel came last. We stamped ration cards for food we never saw, she would later tell an American interviewer, her voice flat with the memory. By January 1945, breakfast was a crust of bread, if she was lucky. Lunch was a thin soup, mostly water, with a few withered potato skins floating in it. Some days there was only the soup. The taste was bitter, metallic, more like dish water than sustenance. Her body, starved of calories, began cannibalizing itself. Fat reserves vanished first, then muscle tissue. Her periods stopped. Her hair thinned and fell out in clumps. Her gums bled when she brushed her teeth. Standing at her desk, she felt lightheaded, her vision narrowing to a tunnel. Climbing stairs left her gasping. The winter of 1945 was brutal. Temperatures plunged, and the wind off the Elbe River cut through thin walls and thinner coats. Keith wore every piece of clothing she owned, layered like armor against the cold, but it did nothing to stop the constant shivering. Her body had no fuel to burn, no fat to convert into warmth. She and her co-workers tried to laugh about it, gallows humor, in a collapsing empire, but their laughter came out weak and hollow. By March, the supply office itself was a fiction. The depots they managed had been bombed into craters. The trains they scheduled existed only on outdated timetables. Cossie unit began retreating westward, moving from one makeshift post to another, always on foot, always hungry. Her boots, once snug, now slipped on her feet because the flesh had melted away. The leather rubbed new paths into her skin with every step, opening sores that wept fluid and attracted infection. There were days with no food at all, she recalled. We walked and tried not to think about it. Some people just sat down by the roadside and didn't get up again. When British forces captured her group in May 1945, Keith weighed 90 pounds. Her cheeks were sunken, her eyes too large for her face, her legs so weak she could barely support her own diminished weight. The British gave her basic rations, maybe 1,600 calories a day, enough to halt the freefall, but not enough to rebuild what months of starvation had destroyed. Then came the transfer to American custody and the Atlantic crossing. The voyage took 2 weeks. The transport ship reeked of fuel oil, unwashed bodies, and the sour smell of seasickness. Keith spent most of the journey vomiting into a bucket, her stomach rejecting even the small amounts of food she tried to eat. By the time the ship docked in New York, she had likely lost more weight. The train ride to Texas, 4 days of rattling wheels and coal smoke, was a blur. She could barely walk without assistance, clinging to the arm of another prisoner just to make it to the latrine and back. When she finally stepped into Morrison's exam room at Camp Swift, she had been living under starvation conditions for at least 6 months. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Height, 5'6". Weight, 87 pounds. Body mass index, 14. A healthy woman, her height should weigh at least 130 pounds. Keith was missing a third of her body. Morrison ordered a full workup. Blood pressure dangerously low, pulse rapid but thready, temperature slightly elevated, a sign her body was fighting infections. It lacked the resources to defeat. When she peeled off her socks, the full horror became visible. Her calves had no muscle left, just bone wrapped in skin. Her ankles and feet were swollen despite her emaciation, a paradox called edema, where the body retains fluid even as it consumes itself. The sores on her feet were deep, some exposing bone, several clearly infected. Morrison had seen wounded soldiers, but he had never seen a young woman so thoroughly destroyed by hunger. "How long have you had trouble walking?" he asked through an interpreter. "Since January, maybe February," Kate answered softly, her eyes fixed on the floor. "The rations became small, then very small, then almost nothing. My legs, they stopped listening to me." Morrison wrote in his report that night, "Patient appears 60 in gait, 24 in face. Body has been consuming its own muscle for months. This is not propaganda. This is reality." The paradox was inescapable. Keith sat in an exam room in Texas, a state where cattle ranches stretched to the horizon, where grain silos overflowed, where American soldiers ate 3 hot meals a day. Yet the prisoner before him, a citizen of a nation that had once claimed it would rule Europe, was dying of starvation. Morrison had expected to see battle wounds, perhaps tuberculosis or typhus. He had not expected to see the slow biological collapse of an entire society written on one woman's body. That night he made a decision that would ripple far beyond Camp Swift. He recommended that every woman in Kate's transport, all 30 of them, receive a full medical examination with a focus on nutrition. If Kate's condition was typical, he suspected the problem was far larger than a single case. Major Thomas Henderson, the camp's chief medical officer, read Morrison's report the next morning. His expression darkened with each page. "This is systematic starvation," Henderson said quietly. "Or a complete collapse of supply," Morrison replied. "Either way, if she's typical, we have a problem." Henderson nodded. "Examine them all. Document everything. We need facts, not guesses." For 3 days the exam room became an assembly line of grim discoveries. One by one, the women from KT Transport stepped inside, and one by one, the numbers painted the same devastating picture. Out of 30 women, 23 showed clear signs of severe malnutrition. 15 had body mass indexes below 16, dangerously underweight by any medical standard. 8 had bleeding gums and loose teeth, classic signs of scurvy from vitamin C deficiency. 6 had the same paradoxical swelling in their legs despite being skeletal. A woman from Berlin whispered, "I used to weigh 65 kilos. Now I am 42. I stopped looking in mirrors." A telegraph operator said, "We were told to be proud, to endure. But you cannot endure when there is nothing to eat." Their stories were nearly identical to Kai's. Rations cut again and again. Trains that never arrived. 1 thin soup a day by March. Some days nothing by April. Office workers, radio operators, clerks, people far from the front lines had become the lowest priority in a system that was eating itself from within. Morrison's notes evolved from individual case files into a pattern, a statistical portrait of collapse. He wrote, "Findings consistent across majority of group. Evidence of 4 to 6 months of inadequate calories and multiple vitamin deficiencies. Condition not due to individual neglect, but to systemic breakdown." He took photographs with the women's permission. The camera clicked in the silent room, capturing legs like branches, shoulders like coat hangers, swollen ankles above worn boots. Years later, those black and white images would appear in medical textbooks about starvation, stark evidence of what happens when a modern state loses the ability to feed its people. When Morrison finished all 30 examinations, he assembled a comprehensive report, tables of heights and weights, symptom summaries, a clear, unflinching conclusion. These prisoners were not simply enemies to be processed, they were medical emergencies requiring immediate intervention. Major Henderson called a meeting of the camp's medical staff. The room was crowded, the air thick with Texas heat, and the gravity of what they were about to undertake. Henderson held up Morrison's report. "This is not an isolated case," he said. "Out of one transport of 30 women, more than 2/3 are seriously malnourished. Nearly half are in the severely underweight range. This is reality, and it is now our responsibility." He laid out new protocols with military precision. All incoming prisoners would receive full medical exams focused on nutrition. Anyone with a BMI under 17 would receive extra rations and medical oversight. Anyone showing vitamin deficiencies would receive supplements vitamin C D-B complex, iron. Infected wounds would be treated immediately, and a special ward would be created for those requiring long-term nutritional rehabilitation. Captain Morrison would organize it. One doctor asked, "Are we equipped to provide this level of care for enemy prisoners?" Henderson's answer was swift. "The Geneva Convention demands adequate treatment. More than that, it's simply the right thing to do." The contrast was razor-sharp. German officers had filed paperwork while their own clerks starved. Now American officers were writing new rules to protect those same former enemies. They had come to Camp Swift expecting to guard prisoners. They were now, in part, protecting patients. As the meeting ended, plans began for a converted barracks. 20 beds, extra nursing staff, new supplies of high-protein foods and vitamins. The next phase would be more delicate than counting calories on paper. It would mean rebuilding broken bodies one careful meal at a time, walking a tightrope between too little food and too much. What happened inside that ward would test not only medical knowledge but also patience, because the staff was about to learn that feeding a starving person too quickly could be as dangerous as starvation itself. The new medical ward was a long wooden barracks, stripped of bunks and fitted with white-sheeted hospital beds. The air smelled of soap, boiled linens, weak broth, and the sharp bite of disinfectant. Keith and 7 other women, the worst cases, were moved there first. When they lay flat, their bones pressed through the thin mattresses. When they sat up, exhaustion claimed them within minutes. Captain Morrison walked the row each morning with a clipboard, while nurses took pulses, temperatures, blood pressures. Every number was recorded. Every heartbeat counted. These figures would guide everything. Feeding them was like walking on a knife's edge. Too little, and recovery would stall. Too much, too fast, and their damaged bodies could fail catastrophically. Morrison had read about refeeding syndrome, a dangerous metabolic shock that occurred when starved bodies suddenly received normal meals. Electrolytes could swing wildly. Hearts could stop. The protocol was strict. Week 1, Morrison told his staff, no more than 1,200 calories a day. 6 small meals. Easy foods, broths, porridges, soft eggs if they can tolerate them. We watch closely. The first trays arrived. Thin oatmeal, a spoonful of mashed potato, a small slice of soft bread, weak tea. To a healthy soldier, it would look like almost nothing. To these women, it was more food than they had seen in months. Keith ate slowly, not from hunger, but because she was told to. Her stomach cramped. She felt nauseous after only a few bites. "There's so much," she whispered to the nurse, staring at the half-full bowl. "My body has forgotten how to eat." But the nurses urged them on one small spoon at a time. If someone felt sick, the next portion was delayed, not canceled. The goal was steady intake, not large meals. Morrison ordered daily weigh-ins. The numbers barely moved in the first week. Some women gained a pound, some gained nothing. One lost a little as the worst of her edema resolved. "Do not be discouraged," Morrison told them. "Your body is learning again. This takes time." In week 2, calories rose to 1,500 a day. The food grew richer, more potatoes, a bit of meat, thicker soups. Vitamin tablets were added, chalky and bitter on the tongue, but vital. Vitamin C for gums and skin. Vitamin D and calcium for bones. B-complex for nerves. Iron for thin blood. By the end of that second week, Keith had gained 3 pounds. It didn't show much, but she felt small changes. The constant chill eased. The sores on her feet, now cleaned and dressed daily, began to close at the edges. The swelling in her ankles faded as her body's fluids rebalanced. "There is less fog in my head," she told Morrison during one exam. "I can think without so much effort. It is strange, I almost feel guilty." "Guilty for what?" he asked. "For eating so well when my mother is still in Hamburg," she said. "She has less than this, I'm sure." The paradox was painful. In a land of plenty, the enemy prisoner was gaining strength, calorie by calorie, while her family in ruined Germany faced empty plates. Week 3 and 4 brought further increases up toward 1,800 calories. More protein appeared. Beans, small portions of meat, powdered milk stirred into drinks. The sound of spoons on bowls grew louder. Some women began to ask for seconds. That was a good sign. Physical therapy started in small steps. At first, just sitting up longer, then standing beside the bed with someone holding an elbow. The first walks were just across the ward and back. The floor felt hard under still tender feet, but the pain was less than before. By week 4, Kai's total gain reached 8 pounds. Her face softened slightly. Her hair stopped falling out. She could walk the length of the building without stopping, though she still held the bed rails. Morrison took new photographs. The same legs, but fuller, the sores smaller, the skin less taut over bone. He wrote, "Patient gaining approximately 2 pounds per week. Muscle returning slowly. Wounds healing. No signs of refeeding syndrome. Emotional state improved." By week 12, Keith had gained 22 pounds, reaching roughly 109 pounds, still thin, but out of immediate danger. "I thought I would die," she admitted, sitting in sunlight. Across the ward, others were recovering too. With careful feeding and vitamins, starved bodies could come back. Strength returned, and so did words. Keith spoke of Hamburg, a propaganda promising Americans were starving. She realized sometimes an enemy camp could be safer than home. By late autumn 1945, the Texas air was crisp. Keith could walk across the compound, climb stairs, carry her tray, and fold linens. Her mind, dulled by hunger, felt sharp again. The Red Cross allowed prisoners to send letters home. Keith wrote, "Dear Mama, I am alive. I am in a camp in Texas. I am well. The Americans have fed me. I am grateful, but I feel guilty." By spring 1946, she was repatriated. Streets were blocked by rubble, rations were small, but she had a rebuilt body, skills, and hope.